It is a well-worn tale in American folky lore. That evening in July 1965, when Bob Dylan shocked audiences at the Newport Folk Festival by amplifying his guitar, barreling into the psychedelic late 60s with his rousing, electrified opus, Like a Rolling Stone. Pete Seeger, elder statesman of the previous generation of American folk musicians, rushed to pull the plug, by some accounts to chop the wires with an axe. Yet a familiar hand blocked his path. Theodore Bickel, the folk singer, actor, and Yiddishist, stopped Seeger with a dose of wisdom. You can't do that, Pete. You can't stop the future. This episode affirms the presence of a Yiddish figure in the American folk revival. Now, up to that point, Bickel had largely been aligned with the ideologies and aesthetics of the folk revival, save his sometimes sentimental and dense orchestral accompaniments. Inserting into the tradition in 1958 an album in Yiddish, Theodore Bickel sings Jewish folk songs. Present and notable as he was in the folk scene, Bickel's Jewish Folk Songs album and its sequel, Theodore Bickel Sings More Jewish Folk Songs, challenges us to consider what it meant to do Yiddish in the context of the American folk revival. To be sure, Bickel was not the only one. The Folkways label, operated by Moses Ash, son of Sholem, in addition to more standard American fare such as Leadbelly and Pete Seeger, released several albums of Yiddish folk music. This yields interesting questions for those invested in the evolving place of Yiddish in America. However, this particular exchange has eluded scholars of Yiddish folk music in the United States, who, faced with the semantic ambiguities around the terms Jewish and folk, have sidestepped this issue to focus on the klezmer revival, for example, in Barbara Kirshenblatt Gimblet's Sounds of Sensibility, or on Shlomo Carlebach's Jewish approach to hippie counterculture. You can see Ari Kelman and Shaul Magid's article on Carlebach at the Village Gate, which they sort of define under the rubric of Jewish folk music in America. Given the difficulty, I contend that to properly engage the question of Yiddish folk music within the American folk revival, we must contrast it against a model of someone who famously did Yiddish in America. I suggest the figure of Isaac Bashevis Singer. As everybody here can attest, Singer is one whose works of Yiddish fiction and nonfiction communicate in fascinating ways with his life in America. We've heard a lot of that today. These are experiences about which he spoke openly and prolifically. And today I will think about Isaac in America, interestingly also the title of a 1987 episode of the PBS program American Masters, dedicated to the writer. Both Isaac Singer and Yiddish American folk musicians were producing Yiddish culture against the same mid-20th century American backdrop, one in which the place of Yiddish was evolving rapidly. In considering two creative outlooks cooked in the same kitchen but using different ingredients, I hope not only to present a musical analog to Bashevis, but also to emphasize the terms of studying Yiddish American folk music by offering the larger-than-life figure of Isaac Bashevis Singer as a point of reference. In this paper, I consider the ways in which Bashevis balanced his Yiddish works with his American environment, and I then transpose this balancing act to the specific conditions of the 1950s American folk revival within which Yiddish music functioned. Though there are many dimensions along which this analysis could take place, I will consider two not wholly unrelated aspects, translation and memory. In both Isaac Singer's work and Yiddish American folk music, as I will deem it through the duration of my talk, translation and memory were two important factors which mediated a commitment to Yiddish culturally, politically, and aesthetically, and to the American public sphere, culturally, politically, and aesthetically. So allow me to justify my decision to pair these two, because after all, there was plenty of Yiddish and Jewish cultural production in America during this period, all rich for study. So in terms of Singer, as I take as significant this episode of American Masters, a program which presents documentary profiles on notable American artists. While I concede that PBS has never been the final arbiter of Americanness, it is nonetheless significant that Isaac Singer is held up as an American master, in company with Louis Armstrong, Ray Charles, and Georgia O'Keeffe, among dozens more luminaries. Singer's episode is fascinating, particularly to the extent that his classification as an American master is contingent on a nostalgic relationship with Yiddish culture. The narrative frame of the documentary involves Singer revisiting the ghosts of his past from the vantage point of his life in the mid-1980s, when the writer was already 83 years old. This begins to nudge us towards the idea that the reconciliation of Yiddish with an idea of American is facilitated through the work of memory, celebrating that which remains and conceding gracefully that which has been lost. And I was going to quote the same patriotic fervor that Saul did in his paper, but I'll save you hearing that twice. Singer's short stories, as well as his semi-autobiographical accounts of his time in the United States, notably Lost in America and the short story A Day at Coney Island, present the challenges of maintaining Yiddish in 20th century America. And this conflict has perceptible echoes in Yiddish American folk music. From a historical and cultural perspective, this era in Yiddish American history holds simultaneously the Yiddish tradition in a particular moment of crisis and an American folk revival which was itself constantly reacting to the crises of American industrial modernity and a post-World War II recalibration of ideas surrounding progress. From a historiographical perspective, this moment in Yiddish American music has been regrettably overlooked. While several scholars have produced important works which reference this tradition, typically through the figure of Theodore Bickel, the focus shifts quickly to later in the 1960s and beyond, treating the folk revival of the 1930s to 1950s merely as a precursor. And yet, this pivotal period witnessed an intense negotiation of what constituted an authentic American folk. Particularly interesting, then, is a consideration of where Yiddish culture and politics fit into this evolving narrative of authenticity. And so this sphere is a particularly rich and important scene in which the Yiddish and Jewish relationship to the designation American was constantly negotiated. That scholars have tended to downplay this is, I believe, a missed opportunity. So one dimension along which we can consider this issue for both Bashevis and for Yiddish American folk performers is the axis of translation. And here my thinking is indebted to our colleague Saul Zeret, whose recently published Teich Manifesto offers a mode of reading and, as I argue, listening that highlights the productive uneasiness inherent in translation. Zeret's Teich approach begins with a call that, quote, scholarship needs a translational paradigm to account for the multi-directionality of modern Jewish culture. Significantly, he concludes, quote, Teich indicates a proximity to non-Jewish discourse, a language that is both ours and theirs. And through this frame, Zeret points to the same questions that guide my discussion today. This perspective highlights the degree to which Bashevis managed his relationship to Americanness through his approach to translation, both linguistic and cultural. And in the American Masters episode, he admits, it is known that every writer loses in translation, especially a writer who writes about folklore, especially a writer who believes in the supernatural. All these things together are deeply connected with their environment, with the roots of the people. It's not really easy to translate it into another language. However, we can understand, or maybe we don't, we've kind of been debating this throughout the conference, that Bashevis, the American master, has, despite the inherent limitations of translation, successfully assimilated his multiple identities. And I emphasize here that Bashevis was deeply aware of the means by which translation connected him to both a Yiddish and non-readership, both to a Yiddish and non-Yiddish readership. He explains, quote, I am very happy about my books being translated into English. In English, my audience is a very real one. I don't have to assume or imagine it. It's not as if. And of course, many of my English readers are intelligent Jews who know no other language, and I am very happy to reach them. Bashevis's frank recognition that to present Yiddish works in America requires building a bridge to a non-Yiddish speaking audience illuminates the function of translation then in Yiddish American folk music. This translation occurs in a literal, or should I say literary sense, in which folk music liner notes made a specific and often overwhelmingly thorough use of translation. So just a few examples. This comes from the liner notes of one of Ruth Rubin's albums. You see we have sort of Yiddish text, a transliteration, a translation, a sort of what kind of song it is, some historical notes. The liner notes on these albums were, thick booklets that contained all this information. Here's from Mark Olfsing's Jewish folk songs. Again, this one is a little strange in the fact that it's the Yiddish text and then an English translation, no transliteration, right? So for those who don't read Yiddish, they wouldn't be able to necessarily sing along. And now this one is really interesting to me. Again, there's many sequels here. So there's Jewish Folk Songs #2 by Mark Olf. And I want to just, if you can see my cursor here. So this is Osman Fotkan Sevastopol, also known as John Koya. And this line, Yidden speitze onen ponim, right? Yidden spit in their faces, which is translated to fight their, who says that Jews can't till the soil, fight their enemies, build and toil, right? So there's actually this like breakdown in meaning, which it's not clear to me how many people might have been aware of that, but it's significant. I'll save that for a second. Okay, of course, this translation also occurred on a stylistic level. From the 1920s to the 1950s, that which was called Yiddish folk music in America was, in an overwhelming majority of cases, presented in one of two styles. The first was an unaccompanied vocal style. Think, for example, of the hundreds of unaccompanied vocal performances recorded by Ruth Rubin. And the other dominant tradition of folk music in Yiddish American life came through the leftist folk choirs under the direction of Jacob Schaefer. Here, folk songs were arranged in a choral style reminiscent of the Western European Romantic tradition. So it's crucial then to hear that Yiddish American folk singers like Theodore Bickel, Mark Olf, Alan Mills, Rasha, among others, performed in the dominant style of American folk music. That's a musician accompanied by guitar. The images of Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, and Leadbelly come immediately to mind. This deviation from the standard aesthetic of Yiddish folk music was a means of connecting to a folk music-oriented American audience. We notice that the liner notes of several Folkways albums emphasize what I will call a folk guitaristic legibility. I'll show an example of that in a second. In other words, the presentation of the music emphasizes its ability to be replicated by American folk musicians, who one expects would accompany their vocals with guitar. So let's take a look at this book, The Folk Singer's Guitar Guide. And while Pete Seeger's name is featured prominently, we observe that two key contributors are Moses Ash and Ethel Rame. And both Ash and Rame had a personal and artistic connection to Yiddish, though their work in this period was oriented predominantly towards American folk music. And the book lays out a way for anyone to start playing folk guitar, with sections ranging from buying your first instrument to advanced finger-picking techniques. And undeniable is the focus on Southern American traditions, with the book functioning essentially as a how-to guide for country, blues, and folk guitar. I mean, it's sort of said right here, basic principles of North American folk guitar. And you know, here's a little farther into the book, a few lessons in, we're at page 31, right? We're already starting to accompany ourselves with chords. And so I take as significant then the similarities between the presentation in a folk singer's guitar guide and the chord guide on folk records. So if you'll notice, you know, we have lyrics, a little bit of an accompaniment if you're somebody who, you know, reads music, and then sort of chord chart. And here's from Rasha, Jewish Folk Songs of Europe. We have sort of the same layout. So it was presented in the same style. Now I want to point out that in traditional Ashkenazi music, the tradition of klezmorim, there are specific melodic devices which can inform the harmony. So in music theoretical terms, Ashkenazi music, particularly religious music, was marked by the use of the fourth and fifth modes of the harmonic minor scale. And don't worry, I will show you what that sounds like. So if we're used to hearing a major scale, it might sound like this. Oops. Right, okay, and so then this altered major, which is sometimes called the Freygish mode, sounds like this. Okay, and then in minor, there's a similar thing. This is a natural minor scale. And then an altered minor scale, also sometimes called the Ukrainian Dorian mode. Okay. So in Yiddish American folk albums, we notice that with only a couple of exceptions, this traditional Jewish harmony, these altered modes, is overshadowed by harmonic sequences which align more closely with the expectations of American and Western European music. So the discussion of track selection on these albums is the subject of another paper, perhaps a whole dissertation chapter, which if you'll give me a year or so to write it, it will be available for you. But I contend that the harmonic and guitaristic legibility of Yiddish songs within the American folk revival motivates, to a certain extent, the selection of songs given on these albums. So as an example, the companion songbook to Ruth Rubin's Jewish folk songs looks like this, and it contains 48 Yiddish songs, and within this, only 2 of them deviate from standard American or Western European harmonies. And on the album released by Folkways, which contained only a selection of these, none of those altered modes show up. Now, of course, this did not have to be the case. So Rubin researched and spoke prolifically on Yiddish lullabies, and does sing, one of these lullabies is featured on the album. That's this one. And again, this take my word for it that this sort of 1-4-5 progression is sort of very sort of standard, like American folk fare, right? But we know from the archive that Rubin's field recordings introduced her to lullabies that made use of these altered modes. And so one is the famous example from which we get the image of the Chlorweiss Ziegele under the Wiegele. And so I've sort of highlighted this melodic fall, which incorporates that altered mode. Skip to about 53 seconds. Okay.
Und Jankeles Wiegele steht a Klovei Siegele. The Siegel is gefahren handeln, Rojinkes mit Mandeln. Das ist die beste Schoire. Yankele wird lernen teure.
Right, so she had access to these melodies that use these modes, but on the album they don't show up. Okay, so this notion of translation, of linguistic bridging, pairs with the artistic manifestation of memory, of bridging the past and present. Bashevis's works and his interviews reveal the extent to which his position as a writer in America was marked by his relationship to both personal and collective memory. As Saul Zaret notes, by the 1940s, Bashevis's relationship to Yiddishkeit was rooted in a particular reconstruction of the past. Quote, Bashevis began to call for literary anachronism, writing of and towards the past rather than as a reflection of the fractured present. So I contend that we can map the same conflict around time within the American folk revival, which attempted to remedy the perceived ills of modern society through an evocation of the past. In this regard, the Yiddish folk tradition always had a shared investment with the American folk scene. Now, taking my lead from Svetlana Boym, we can consider memory in terms of nostalgia. Boym offers the evocative claim that, quote, modern nostalgia is a mourning for the impossibility of mythical return, for the loss of an enchanted world with its clear borders and values. It could be a secular expression of spiritual longing, a nostalgia for an absolute, a home that is both physical and spiritual. She continues poignantly that, quote, nostalgia is a sentiment of loss and displacement, but it is also a romance with one's fantasy. David DeTurk and A. Poulin Jr., in their 1968 writing on the American folk scene, sum it up nicely. Quote, if folk music does represent a kind of ideal folk life that is not available anymore in America, its popularity also suggests a species of nonviolent resistance against the quality of contemporary life. This idea aligns with folk music historian Carl Hangstrom Miller's folkloric paradigm, which he employs in a fascinating study of the racial dimensions of American folk music. The nostalgic folkloric paradigm encapsulates the dominant mode of the mid-century folk revival, which took a consistently retrospective approach, consciously obscuring even the technological network which allowed the revival to exist at all. And I do just want to point out, with all our talks of debukim and ghosts, recording technology itself, according to Jonathan Stern, and I happen to agree, began with this kind of magical sense of speaking to the dead. So, you might recognize this image, his master's voice, right on the recording. And as Jonathan Stern notes, he identifies that the dog is standing on the coffin of his master. So, the ability to then hear the dead, right? And that's part of the sort of technological apparatus that allowed this to exist. I'll go back to this slide. So the key consequence of this nostalgia, however, is that despite a rational scientific approach to folklore ethnography, the proponents of the folk revival succumbed to 19th century Romantic era sensibilities, coding the folk tradition with broad brushstrokes of imagination. So in this vein, I suggest that one important mode of engagement with memory for both Yiddish American folk musicians and for Isaac Bashevis Singer is an imagined folkloric overlay. Bashevis proudly inserted the world of the supernatural into his work. He employed the idea of this folkloric imaginary, sometimes challenging the degree to which it was imaginary, to create vivid narrative worlds in which the natural and supernatural constantly collide. And as we've heard during this conference, Bashevis approached his own life in a manner which obscured the boundary between truth and fiction, between the natural and the supernatural. In other words, Bashevis navigated questions of memory through a refusal to accept any one account of history or even reality as indisputably true. It is the case that Singer was operating from this position even as a young man, before he had to contend with the American influence. Satan and Garai, for example, was written while he was still in Poland. However, it is clear from his short stories, interviews, and his American Masters episode that the experience of being in America heightened the challenge of memory in regards to Yiddish, particularly as he grappled with questions of loss and continuity. We might understand then that his obscuring of truth and fiction and overlaying of folkloric imagination was a coping mechanism of sorts in coming to terms with the place of Yiddish in the United States. We can engage the conflict between ethnographic integrity and artistic license also within the realm of folk music. The boundary between fact and fiction with an overlay of folkloric imagination is deeply present in the American folk revival, and particularly in Yiddish singing within it. So on the one hand, there was a commitment to the ethnographic details of Yiddish folk singing. So one need only read Ruth Rubin's Songs of a People or visit the archive of her recordings to sense how deep that commitment was. And likewise on this solo album from Rasha, which we saw before, she's presenting, this is a Bessarabian variant in partial dialect, and she sort of lets us know the facts and figures there. And yet, in many cases, these intricacies were glossed by several aesthetic factors. So for example, we note that on Theodore Bekelsing's Jewish folk songs, he presents a massive historical, thematic, and artistic range of Yiddish songs under one heading, Jewish folk song. And second, the musical performance of the style returns as significant. So on an album with Alan Mills and Rasha, we hear how the varied strains of songs are all lumped under one musical approach. And I'm just going to play one example, but you can check me on this later. Most of the album kind of sounds like this. Another lullaby, just because.
Steht der Chlor weiß Ziegele, das Ziegele ist gefahren handeln.
Okay, so the harmony kind of builds in the guitar, and again, it's reminiscent more of this American and Western European aesthetic than anything else. So a couple more examples. So here's Theodor Bekel. This is, oops, okay, so this is Die Mama is gegangen. This is sort of textbook Bekel standing in front of an audience with his acoustic guitar. And just take a listen to this, singing these folk songs.
Die Mama ist gegangen in Markerein noch Keulen, hat sie mir gebracht a Medaille vom Beulen. Oh, ist das a Medaille, a schöns und a feins, mit die schwarze Egalach, geht's alle du meins.
Okay, so that's one approach that he took. Another, this is arranged by Fred Hellerman, comes from Theodor Bekelsing's more Jewish folk songs, and we can see here the extent to which the music can kind of evoke this imaginary overlay. So let's take a listen here.
Auf'n Fuhrl liegt a Kälbel, liegt gebunden mit a Strick. Euch in Himmel flieht a Schwelbel, dreht sich hin und zurück. Lacht der Wind in Chor, lacht und lacht.
And you know the rest. So this arrangement, a deviation from sparse folk textures, seems to whisk the listener away to a lost world. It has the heft of a Romantic era concerto with an instrumentation that evokes the shtetl. Never mind the fact that this song was written in the 1930s for a New York City Yiddish theater play, actually Esterke, the poster of which we saw in Zahavit's presentation. The affect of the song is the significant factor. Okay. And the goal here is not to criticize Bekel, to the contrary. His albums and those of his peers demonstrate the challenge of evoking memory through musical means. And I want to note with particular emphasis that even the American folk image is itself a type of construction, through which the supposedly pre-modern worlds of Southern African American life and Appalachian culture were strummed, offering a musical means of escaping the present. And through these examples, we see a number of approaches sort of all set on the same goal of memory. So I'll end by returning to the question of why this matters, why the pairing of Isaac Bashevis Singer and Yiddish American musicians of the American folk revival is significant. I understand in both cases that to do Yiddish in America means constantly negotiating issues of aesthetic legibility to facilitate the connection between Yiddish cultural worlds and American contexts. For the study of Singer, we have a contemporaneous example which highlights the particular challenges the writer faced. For Yiddish folk music in America, Bashevis offers a model which grounds our study, providing a frame through which we can confidently probe the intertwined traditions of Yiddish and American music, and to continue the valuable discussions about the place of Yiddish in definitions of Americanness. We deepen our understanding of this period's history and culture when we listen to both singer and singers. Thank you.
Yes, second.
So thank you for this really interesting presentation. I was curious if you are looking at all at the sort of the translations and the texts, and if we're going to extend the Bashevis sort of metaphor a bit further, if translations that are sort of more engaged, poetic, like what Daniel Kahn refers to as like his tradaptations, which he like specifically says is not what Theodor Mikkel is doing, if that could be seen as analogous to this idea of a second original in the English that you get with Isaac Bashevis.
Yeah, I think so, and especially to the fact that, and I don't want to take the time to look for the particular examples, but there are different, I can pull at least one, I can point to this at least in one way. So you'll see here in this Jewish Folk Songs by Ruth Rubin that there are the transliterated texts and literal translations not to be sung. And the reason that this is significant is because there were translations which were meant to be sung, which match the meter of the original and which match the rhyme scheme of the original, even if the meaning was, totally put to the side. So yes, I mean, I think to the extent that somebody could be sitting with a guitar singing a Yiddish folk song in English, and it is a kind of, I don't know if I would go so far as to say a second original, but that it's performable in that way, I think is one of those places where translation is very weird in this situation because, what is the investment? Is the investment in capturing the meaning, or is the investment in having these songs be able to be played even by people who would not feel comfortable singing in Yiddish?